Greetings, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I am so glad you're here. Thanks for tuning in. Tonight, we're going to continue our reading of Garvey and the Vision for Africa.
Greetings. My name is the Revolutionary Matron, and my show is called The Learning Curve. I broadcast on a network called KWAZ Radio. There are other hosts on the network I'd like you to meet.
Greetings, everyone. This is Koku from the Bitter Medicine Podcast, inviting you to tune in to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the Pro-Black Perspective, where black problems are addressed with black solutions.
This is D Webb with the Harsh Reality Podcast, asking you to tune in where we tackle the news of the day that affects our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed here belong solely to the respondents, and they do not necessarily reflect any broadcast networks, affiliates, nor sponsors. The Learning Curve is a broadcast created for the benefit of my global community. Black is a consciousness. Content is being used for our commentary, research, criticism, education, scholarship, teaching, preaching, and news reporting. No copyright infringement is intended. I will make enunciation mistakes. I will give you my opinion about the information. And if you ever ask, I will send you my source.
Marcus Garvey and the Vision of Africa, Chapter 2, Part B. Garvey and Garveyism, an estimate by A.F. Elms, published in May of 1925 in Opportunity magazine. A close-up view of a picture frequently exaggerates elements out of all proportion to their true importance. This principle should also be borne in mind in estimating all human movements. History cannot be written fairly and dispassionately, nor a just interpretation given to the events in the midst of the ferment of such events, nor yet at a time, nor by a person that stands too near the stage of such events. So you can't adequately rewrite history as it's happening. The British Parliament has recently decided to give public publicity to all the documents relating to the recent war. The world will look at with more than ordinary interest and expectancy to such publications. And now, 7 years after the armistice, judgment as to where full responsibility for the war should be placed, what were the causes, primary and secondary, in a word, the interpretation of the facts in full fairness, would do well to wait on these documents. No one will refuse to admit this principle, the principle that human movements cannot be viewed in their true perspective at close range. History must have time to justify itself. Lest there be any prejudice as to the identity of the writer, he wishes to say of himself at the outset that he is not, nor never was, a Garveyite, nor has he at any time shown any disposition to become an orthodox disciple of Garvey. He has no stock in the defunct Black Star Line, nor in any of the enterprises fostered by the movement. He claims no particular fitness to declare himself on the subject except that of an outsider, a student of human movements, a sympathetic observer of Garvey, and the workings of the colossal and unwieldy program he inaugurated. So, what he's saying is that he doesn't have a dog in this fight as the author of this particular work. He just wants it to be clear that he doesn't have any bias when it comes to reviewing this information. In Harlem and in other parts of the country, the writer has had the experience of personal encounters, unaccompanied, however, by any physical violence, with ardent disciples of Garvey, and he numbers among these some of his friends who themselves have been puzzled as to the writer's inability, perhaps more frankly, his mental obtuseness in not being able to recognize this savior of his race. His contacts have been wide, and he has watched and studied the movement, read with avidity the Negro world, and he has before him, as he pens this article, the Constitution and Book of Laws made for the government of the Universal Negro Improvement Association, Incorporated, and the African Communities League, Incorporated of the world, revised and amended August of 1920. Newspaper and magazine articles have appeared on both sides, and the language of some of these have been poignantly sarcastic, and many of them have descended to the plane of abuse and personal vilification of the man Garvey, and they have all had wide circulation. Now that the tumult and shouting is about to subside in both pro and anti Garvey camps, now that Garvey himself has passed into the shadows of the federal prison and open opposition to him has necessarily been rendered futile, it were well for some sympathetic outsider whose state of mind thus characterized would fit him eminently to present the case frankly and openly to do so. Let it be observed that no man could stand in one of those teeming Liberty Hall audiences, once see one of Garvey's ostentatious parades, hear Garvey's magnetic voice, read his Negro world, watch the sweep of his ideas, and then say there was nothing to it. Let him do this, and he would cast a serious doubt on his mental integrity. This is apart entirely from the goodness or the badness of Garveyism. This is something to it, all reasonable men will readily admit. And how does it come to be? It is the personality of Garvey himself. Call him what you will, a visionary, impossible idealist, fanatical reformer, unprincipled opportunist. Behind these epithets lie the unconquerable fact that Garvey, the personality of the man who has dramatically attracted the attention of the world. Contrary to much of what was hitherto been published, I believe the man was not fundamentally insincere. What he saw, and there was no make believe in his own mind. True, many of his followers have been disappointed. They were duped, bewildered, bewitched, and surrendered reason as well as ready money. This thing has not worked out as they expected, but in Garvey's own mind, there was a close fit between what he gave forth and what he held in his mind. I think he was substantially and in the main sincere. Greetings, Anthony McBell and KW Don 7. Thanks so much for tuning in. This is A.F. Elms writing on Garvey and Garveyism. If I understand his program correctly, he was sound in his basic contention for his people. Above, I gave a passing characterization to his program as being unwieldy. The objects of the UNIA, as given in its Constitution and Book of Laws, make me smile as I read them over. They go from reclaiming the fallen and assisting the needy to establishing a Negro nation in Africa, from helping backwards tribes in Africa to the founding of universities, colleges, academies, and worldwide commerce enterprise. Comprehensive, colossal, top-heavy, and impossible. No one man is wise nor powerful enough to sit astride so many horses at one and the same time. Interpreting this manifold objects synthetically as Garvey sought to have them carried out in practice, what do we find? He is contending for the principle of a self-sustaining, self-propagating group life that as a race, the Negro will not rise into the fullness of racial selfhood until his group becomes fully competent and adequate in resources for the demands of his economic, political, moral, and spiritual life. What is there against this? All Negro organizations vote its full adoption with both hands up. In principle, yes, we do. No man who is content to remain poor for his normal needs seeks dependence on others merits much respect. No race comes into the place of dignified selfhood that stays poor. Marcus Garvey argues when the colored man needs a suit of clothes, there should be a colored tailor competent to fit him, a colored wholesale store from which the goods can be procured, colored factory for the preparation of the raw material, colored producers for the raw material, and ships manned and owned by men of his race to transport the goods. He would close up the whole economic circle with agents and agencies of his own people. Thus, he carried the doctrine and in other aspects of Negro life. Is not this principle valid for a program of uplift and advance for any people? Marcus Garvey, while fundamentally sincere, unhappily failed to realize his limitations, and the tremendous sweep of his mind was not balanced by adequate penetrating power. While he dreamed the emotional content of those dreams, the showy fabric of his visions bore him away in method from the immediate or remotely practicable. In short, for the carrying out of such universal aims, there seemed wanting in the leader many of the intellectual prerequisites. No estimate of Garveyism as a social movement can ignore the fact that his personality, plus the mere size of the things he attempted to do, gave him a good measure of the power of his appeal. He thought in terms large and universal, and would in one organization encompass the alpha to the omega of his people's progress. Such a mind is usually, quote unquote, short in analytic power and penetrative capacity. Garvey's was eminently so. His very inability for clear-cut analytical reasoning made him intolerant of interference and made him assume at times the investiture of divine rightness and supernatural inspiration for his scheme. Garvey was a prophet. He was possessed of great and noble passion. The fervor with which he believed in himself and his message, the full measure of his devotion to what he held to be right, cannot be successfully gainsaid. He missed the mark on method and procedure. Like other reformers that went before him, this passion for redemption of his people led him beyond the bounds of discretion, and his inability to sense his limitations was really a dire element in his psychology. Garveyism came to be regarded by a number of well-thinking Negroes as a gospel of hate for white people and all that appertains to this group. This was worse than unfortunate. No program of permanent uplift for the Negro can successfully proceed on such an issue. Breathing out threatenings and slaughter against the dominant element among whom we live and move and have our being was common among the disciples of Garvey, foolish and worse. Teach Negroes to hate white people, and it will soon be impossible to teach them to love and think well of their own. Garveyism lost much of the intelligent sympathy. If not open avowal, it might have gained by the fiery ebullitions of its ardent ambassadors. Nevertheless, our judgment of Garvey and his movement, I will say, should not be given on this account only. It is meet to observe that the reformers and seers are prone to deliver themselves in such manner. It is also true that the excesses to which a movement goes should not necessarily bias judgment in this direction. Reformers, prophets, and human movements that would rectify an existing order have this habit. Liberty, equality, fraternity are the accepted bulwarks of democracy. Turn to the story of the French Revolution and see the extravagance out of which these ideas were salvaged. They would tear down everything, yea, and religion also. On the corner street in Paris, a red Republican was heard to declare how they were going to destroy churches, crucifixes, and shrines, all that stood for the perpetuation of religion. Yet history points proudly to that event as marking the birthday of the modern democratic movement. Garvey's was a great idea. It had in it a remarkable power of appeal and contagion. When a great idea deeply lays hold of the minds of a group with other suggestive elements in its mental and social atmosphere cooperating, it is liable to cause commotion, and as a result, throw up to the attention much frothy and extraneous matter. The phenomenal spread of Garveyism further must be attributed to the leader's knowledge of the psychology of his people, joined to this fact, and this is most significant, of the time and circumstances in which the movement was inaugurated. Mark the elements in Negro psychology which he took cognizant of and marshaled to his service. Garvey proves a conviction of my own that only the Negro can properly interpret the Negro. The love of symbols, the craving for power and titles, plume nights and showy parades, all these Garvey took and exploited for the UNIA. All the gorgeous periphery in dress, court, display. Fantastic titles were very relevant to his aim. The capture of the heart, if not the head, and the imagination of the masses of his people. And it worked. He captured, moreover, some of the intellectuals. This was a splendid achievement. If only the leader had had the good sense to bind this latter class to himself for counsel, executive direction, and business management in the special lines of his manifold enterprises, the crash might have been postponed and made much less dramatic. I am not convinced that some crash would have been altogether avoided, for Garvey, flattered by success, grew dogged and impatient of the counsel of others. And now Marcus Garvey is behind bars, convicted of using the mails to defraud, and the most pertinent question is, what of the UNIA? Orthodox disciples of his give the answer to the satisfaction of those within the fold. It could be well put, Garvey's body lies, but his soul goes marching on. But for the masses of Negroes outside of the fold, who do but ill to rejoice in the downfall of Garvey, it were well to discover if there is anything in this wreck of hopes and enterprise that may well be salvaged. Here is one thing. Sit this down to the eternal credit of Marcus Garvey, that before him there has not been a man who stirred the expression of consciousness of the Negro peoples to the extent that he has succeeded in doing. Extent both in degree and geographical area over which his ideas swept. Negroes all over the world have come to think of themselves as a race, one in hope and destiny as never before. Now, this I count to being a thing of high value. This consciousness of race has been perhaps more vocal in America than anywhere else among Negroes, and therefore, before Garvey, you will say, but Garvey gave it larger proportions and doubtless a height to which it had never risen. Under the spell of his propaganda, it was amplified to an extent that gives justification to the name of his organization, Universal Negro Improvement Association. Thus, the present state into which Garvey has fallen offers a new challenge. That new challenge is for some new leader of equal breadth and sympathy, more practical in intellect, and of sober counsel to give himself the task of the conservation of this race consciousness for the future good of this people. Much of this great spiritual product has come to be regarded as a thing greatly needed. It would be a pity to see it lost under the crash of Garvey's fall. Perhaps this leader can be found in the ranks of the UNIA. Finally, it does not do to treat Garveyism with detached indifference. It does not do to blame, decry, nor vilify any of the sweeping, indiscriminate manner, nor yet without sneering others teach to sneer. Many an outsider like myself may be brought sooner or later to admit, after all, there was something to it. And those are the words of A.F. Elms. These are memoirs of a captain of the Black Star Line, published by Steer, A Star to Steer by Captain Hugh Mozak in the International Publishers of New York, 1963. The events which drew me to the Garvey movement in 1920 were also attracting millions of other colored men and women. Chiefly among them was the outrageous discrimination which we had been subjected to during the war, both in the Army and in civilian jobs. Though Afro Americans constituted only 10% of the United States population, they contributed 13% of the soldiers. President Wilson had promised that with thousands of your young sons in camps and in France, out of this conflict, you must expect nothing less than the enjoyment of full citizenship rights, the same as are enjoyed by any other citizens. However, he lifted not a finger to halt the vicious murders and programs which raged through the South when the troops returned home. The spectacle of Black bodies dangling from Southern trees or burned on the stake was commonplace. Their bones and the chains that bound them often distributed to the mob as souvenirs. Afraid that the U.S. colored troops would learn too much from the French democracy, the Army issued its notorious Order Number 40, forbidding colored troops to associate with white women. And Wilson sent Dr. Robert Russa Moton, Booker T. Washington's successor at Tuskegee Institute, to France to warn the Negro GIs not to expect freedom and equality when they return home. In the flight from lynch terror and in search of opportunity, colored men and women began moving north as early as the second decade of the century. Individuals, families, whole communities gathered their meager belongings and set out for Hartford, New York, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, Cleveland, and Youngstown, Chicago, St. Louis, and Kansas City. Between 1915 and 1920, more than 1 million colored people found their way to the segregated tenements of the North. If they were looking for a promised land, they were doomed to disappointment. In the North, factory doors were usually closed to them, and most unions rigidly enforced the color bar. They met social abuse, debasement, the thwarting of ambition, caricature, and the disparagement of their culture. The government in Washington did not hide its disdain for its colored citizens, and the administrations of Wilson and Harding's after him viewed America's racial crisis with deep seated unconcern. With the founding of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People in 1909 and the National Urban League in 1911, many leading colored intellectuals and professional men and women joined with sympathetic whites to launch an attack upon the political, social, and economic proscriptions under which the Negro labored. But against the solid wall of American race prejudice, North and South, progress was painfully slow. The Negro intellectuals enjoyed very limited support among the colored masses. Racial pride had not yet developed to today's political level. Too few colored citizens could go to school. Too few voted. Too few were able to free themselves from the daily hardship of earning a living. The honest, dedicated leaders with few victories to show could neither attract a militant following nor convince their hosts, however brilliantly their pleas for full citizenship were set forth, that their appeals needed to be answered. It was in this setting of bitter disillusionment following the war to make the world safe for democracy that Marcus Garvey, for a brief time, occupied the center stage in the unfolding drama of the Black man's struggle. Garvey had been a teacher in his native Jamaica, and in 1914, at the age of 47, had founded the Universal Negro Improvement Association. In 1916, the association's headquarters moved to New York, and aided by heavy Negro immigration, I-migration, from Puerto Rico, Haiti, Cuba, and the British West Indies, by 1921 had 418 chapters, with a membership alleged to total more than 2 million in the United States alone. The objective of the UNIA was to redeem the continent of Africa for the Africans, at home and abroad. That mighty, dark land had been the chief prize of the Western powers following World War I. And if its vast natural and human resources were enough to set white men at each other's throats, Garvey reasoned, why could it not also move Black men to action? Garvey envisioned a sort of super government which would unite the peoples of African descent in Africa, the United States, Latin and South America, and the other parts of the world, and direct their destinies. A Black Zion. He sought to bring these millions of disenfranchised Black folk under one discipline, just as the Pope and the Catholic Church control millions in every land. Garvey encouraged colored business and manufacturing enterprises, which were stimulated and guided by African Factories Corporation. He sought to win followers and bind them together through a militant organ, the Negro world. He advocated increased trade between the United States, West Indies, and Africa under Black men's control. The Black Star Steamship Corporation was to be the means to this end. Garvey was an inspired organizer with a flair for promotion, and he launched his enterprises with the most powerful appeals to Black African nationalism. Help float more ships, read one brochure, and write the name of the race across the commercial world of history, the commercial history of the world. White men have invested in their own propositions and make millions while crushing the souls of Black men. White men have done what white men have done, colored man can do, read another. The appeal to race patriotism, the promise of an African Renaissance under their own control, and the attraction of rapidly multiplying dollars drew colored folk to the Garvey movement as they had not been drawn by any other since the Civil War and Reconstruction. When I emerged at the subway exit on 135th Street and Lenox Avenue, many a curious passerby on the crowded street stopped to stare at my master's uniform, for I had dressed for the occasion. But as I made my way toward the UNIA headquarters, or to within a block of it, I discovered a line more than 100 yards long waiting to enter 56 West 135th Street. There were job seekers and supplicants, stock owners to be, and a few hero worshipers who simply wanted to tell Mr. Garvey how proud they were of him for what he was doing for the race. Since I had an appointment, I walked past and up the stairway leading from the first floor to the second, and the second to the third. There in the topmost office was a counter stacked high with bundles of bills of small denominations, the savings of thousands of earnest, hard-working folks who had come to buy $5 shares of stock in the Black Star Line. Off this room was Mr. Garvey's office. As I entered, he rose from the desk and gave me my hand a fierce shake. "Glad to see you, Mozak," he said, giving me a piercing look from his deep black eyes set in a fleshy but well-formed face. Sit down," he ordered me, and started to unfold his dream before I had even obeyed his command. Garvey was a short, stocky man of pure African descent. As he expounded, taking off every few moments in a flight of oratory, his black eyes flashed and his quick fingers drove home each point. At one moment, he was wildly castigating white men for their cruelty and hypocrisy, and the next extolling the greatness of ancient African civilizations and recounting the unlimited wealth of the mother continent. Throughout our half-hour meeting, during which he outlined the greatest Back to Africa movement the world has ever seen, I sat transfixed with awe. "I am going to make you chief officer of the Yarmouth," he said, "but this is only the beginning. You are going to help man a vast fleet of speedy ships engaged in the African trade. Afro-Americans shall come into their own." "Yes, yes," I assented, entranced by the enthusiasm of this man who was obsessed with what he considered to be the great idea. Before I left, I had purchased 5 shares of stock in the Black Star Line and cherished a clear vision of being commander of a great fleet. First-hand contact with one of Mr. Garvey's enterprises a few days later began to undermine my more grandiose illusions. Although a great deal of publicity had attended the launching of the first ship, in the proposed Black Star Fleet, the Yarmouth was not a vessel to set a sailor's heart aflame. She had been built in Scotland 34 years earlier and was undoubtedly a fine vessel at the time of her first christening, a year before my birth. But she had been used for coal as a coal boat during the war, and by the time Garvey acquired her, she was something less than seaworthy. Her boiler crowns were in need of repair, and her hull was practically worn out. She could not have been worth a penny over 25,000 when the Black Star Line acquired her for $165,000. To add insult to injury, though she was always referred to as the SS Frederick Douglass in Black Star publicity, the Yarmouth she was and the Yarmouth she was to remain to the day she was sold for scrap. Her career under Black Star operation had not been one to inspire confidence either. On her second voyage, she had been chartered to take a cargo of whiskey to Cuba just a few days before Prohibition took effect. Mr. Garvey and Smith Green, vice president, had drawn up a contract without consulting the ship's master, Captain Charles Cockburn. And although the cargo was worth in excess of $1 million, they had chartered her for 11,000, a sum insufficient even to get her to her destination, let alone return a dividend for the poor stockholders. Unfortunately, the vessel had been loaded in such haste that in heavy weather off Cape May, the cargo had shifted, giving her a heavy starboard list. Part of the cargo had to be jettisoned, and the Yarmouth limped back to New York under a Coast Guard escort. Greetings, Forecast and Brother Bakari. I'm so glad you're here. It was at this point, while she laid an anchor off the Statue of Liberty, that I went aboard, January 23rd, 1920. Captain Cockburn, a tall colored man who had sailed the African coast for years and had a British master's license, quickly brought me up to date on the Yarmouth's misadventures and his differences with Marcus Garvey. Still under the influence of Garvey's rhetoric, however, I declined to take sides. My immediate task was clear: to make the Yarmouth as shipshape as possible so we could resume our voyage. Not only was she carrying a heavy list, but the ashes from her furnaces had been dumped under the lifeboats. The cargo was topsy-turvy. Dunnage was all over the vessel. Much of the gear was not in operating condition, and her plates were covered with rust. I called for a gang of stevedores and made the ship snap to. Several days later, Mr. Garvey came aboard and was so pleased with the appearance of the vessel that he hinted broadly that he intended to discharge Captain Cockburn and make me the master of the vessel. I was anxious not to be put in such an ambiguous position. First, because while Mr. Garvey was the boss ashore, Cockburn was the master at sea. But more to the point, since the Yarmouth was under British registry, my American license would not qualify me to take command. Also, I was imbued with the spirit of the Garvey movement and had no selfish ambitions. But I was soon to learn it was naive to suppose one could remain neutral in any undertaking involving Marcus Garvey. Wherever he went, whatever he undertook, excitement and controversy followed in his wake. On February 27th, we raised an anchor with the ship in as good a shape as she had been in years. We sailed in clear weather and arrived in Havana on March 3rd. The Yarmouth's arrival had been heralded by Cuban agents of the UNIA, and sympathizers flocked from all parts of the island toward the docks to greet the first ship they had ever seen entirely owned and operated by colored men. They came out in boats when we arrived, showering us with flowers and fruit, but we couldn't let them aboard. We lay at anchor for 5 days awaiting for a berth, and I worked the crew overtime cleaning and painting the ship so we could make a good impression. Finally, however, we moved to the dock and were overrun with visitors from dawn till sunset. Since the charter party's overriding interest had been in getting the cargo of whiskey out of the United States water, no arrangements had been made for a Cuban's consignee. Normally, the owners of a vessel are protected against delays by a demurrage clause in the contract. But because there was no formal consignee and the operators had failed to insist upon protection of a demurrage clause in their contract with the owners of the liquor, every delay meant that the vessel lost more money. To the 5 day wait at anchorage was added a 2 week delay when we tied up because of a longshore strike. Thus, instead of collecting the value of its cargo space for each day's delay, including Sundays, which would have amounted to several $1,000s daily, we not only lost our expenses and possible profits, but had to pay the maintenance of the 35 passengers bound for Jamaica and other Caribbean ports. Though Captain Cockburn and I were almost constantly occupied with such dispiriting details, we found time to enjoy the welcome of the Cuban people. The President Monaco went on from the President Monaco on down. There was a party nearly every night. President Monaco honored us in a banquet at the presidential palace and expressed his great pride in seeing colored men make their own opportunities in the field of commerce. Before the evening was over, he promised the support of the Cuban government for the ventures of the Black Star Line. Many other Cuban businessmen and landowners also pledged their cooperation. One particularly influential senator who owned several thousand acres of sugarcane said that he had been shipping all of his sugar by United Fruit Company vessels, but would readily switch to Black Star if we could promise him seaworthy vessels and good service. In scores of formal and informal gatherings, the officers and men of the Yarmouth were feted, and at every one, some Cuban businessman promised us his trade. Many brought stock in the Black Star Line. Finally, after 32 days in port, we discharged our cargo in bond and with only passengers aboard left for Jamaica. Again, hundreds greeted us at the dock. With no cargo to load or discharge, we remained only long enough to repair the boilers and take on bunkers and stores. Then we left for Colón, the Panama Canal Zone, and the biggest reception of all. Literally thousands of Panamanians swarmed over the docks with the baskets of fruit, vegetables, and other gifts. I was amazed that the Yarmouth had become such a symbol for the colored citizens of every land. Greetings, Pro-Black Perspective. I'm so glad you're here. This writing is by the ship captain, and his name is Captain Hugh Molzak. And he's talking about his experiences when he went on the voyages with the vessel, the Yarmouth, which is also named the SS Frederick Douglass. Okay. All right. I was amazed that the Yarmouth had become such a symbol for the colored citizens of every land. Back in the 1880s and 1890s, when two French companies had begun construction of the canal, several thousand West Indians had emigrated to the canal zone and had remained when the United States took over the project in 1904. When Americans succeeded the French as builders, however, they brought with them not only great resources of capital and technological skill, but also that characteristic hallmark of United States civilization: flagrant racial discrimination. The colored and white signs which designate public facilities throughout the South had been placed in Panama by gold and silver signs. The West Indians resented having to buy provisions from the silver commissary while their white colleagues purchased from the gold store, an indignity that applied even at the post office. Even an even more grievous affront, however, was that the gold pay envelopes invariably contained more money than the silver ones, even when the workers performed the same duties side by side. From 1904 on, the West Indians had fought this treatment bitterly, defeating an effort to institute segregation on streetcars and in theaters. Resentment was at a fever pitch when we tied up in 1920, and thousands were anxious to leave the canal zone. We finally agreed to take 500 to Cuba, which was then importing workers for the sugar and banana plantations. The accommodations I hastily constructed in the holds were terribly inadequate, and before we were to discharge our passengers at Santiago de Cuba, we encountered many difficulties, including shortages of fuel, food, and equipment. But the migrants preferred risking these hazards to remaining a moment longer in a country where they were not free. En route to Cuba, again at the insistence of Mr. Garvey, we put in at del Toro, Almirante, and Puerto Rico, Limon, Costa Rica. In all three, we were accorded the welcome of conquering heroes. At Bocas del Toro, thousands of peasants came down from the hills on horses, donkeys, and in makeshift carts, and by way of special train provided by the United Fruit Company, which, since it was going to lose its employees for the day anyway, declared it a legal holiday. The crowd on the dock was so thick that when we drew our heaving lines ashore, the peasants seized the hawsers as they came out of the water and literally breasted us alongside the dock. In the tumult that followed, dancing broke out on the deck. Great piles of fruit and flowers mounted down the hatch covers, and the UNIA agents signed up hundreds of new members. Yet it was clear to me that we had no reason at all to be in these ports. There was no cargo to be loaded or discharged. We had 500 passengers aboard to be fed and cared for. The Yarmouth was simply being used as a propaganda device for recruiting new members to the Universal Negro Improvement Association. It was a hell of a way to run a steamship. When our passengers were finally discharged at Santiago de Cuba, the Yarmouth sailed for Kingston, Jamaica, for a cargo of coconuts and to have the boiler crowns repaired again. By this time, a routine job. Just before leaving Kingston, we received fresh orders from Mr. Garvey. Coconuts or no coconuts, we were to depart at once for Boston. The British government still maintained wartime restrictions on food exports from Jamaica, and it was impossible to secure sufficient provisions for the trip home. Captain Cockburn therefore found it expedient to stop at Nassau and then Norfolk for stores and fuel. And in the latter port, new orders awaited us. A UNIA celebration was being held in Philadelphia, and we should put in there for a few days en route to Boston. Orders are orders, even when 700 tons of coconuts for New York are rotting in the hold. We dutifully steamed for Philadelphia. The UNIA celebrations in both ports were spectacular affairs, with thousands joining the parades. Garvey made impassioned speeches, whipping the people into frenzied support of the association. Luckily, he had also scheduled a celebration in New York, so the Yarmouth could finally deliver its cargo. The crew of the Yarmouth joined the parade, which at its peak started at 116th Street and Lenox Avenue and stretched down to 100th Street over to 7th Avenue and back up to 145th Street. As far as I am aware, it was the greatest demonstration of colored solidarity in American history before or since. The coconuts, of course, were rotten. The incensed owners promptly filed a damage suit against the Black Star Line, bringing into bold relief another instance of the company's inefficiency. The contract did not contain any limit upon company responsibility. Further, no one in the office had any idea how to check damage claims submitted by the owners of the cargo, placing the company at the complete mercy of the shipper and forced to depend on his estimate of the value of the cargo instead of its own. While in New York, Captain Cockburn's differences with Mr. Garvey reached the boiling point, and the first break in the solid black flanks occurred. A Captain Dixon, a white Canadian with English papers, was hired as master. For propaganda purposes, Garvey announced that I had been appointed master of the Phyllis Wheatley, a ship that didn't even exist yet. The second voyage of the Yarmouth was but for one unusual incident. Virtually a repetition of the first. So the second voyage of the Yarmouth, but for one unusual incident, was virtually a repetition of the first. We were chartered to load fertilizer for Cuba and, after discharging there, sailed for Port-au-Prince, Haiti, and another admiring throng. From Port-au-Prince, we headed for Kingston and a final commercial debacle. A Japanese vessel, the Kiyomiru, had gone aground on the Sierra Banks, 500 miles south of Jamaica, and for 2 weeks had been waiting for a rescue vessel to relieve her of part of her cargo so she could float or be pulled off. No ship, however, had been willing to risk this operation. Captain Dixon and I both assured Mr. Wilson, agent for the Black Star in Kingston, that we could do the job and advised him to charter us for $45,000. The owners of the cargo and Lloyd's of London would willingly have paid this sum, for this was salvage cargo with a freight value from 3 to 5 times the value of ordinary cargo. Mr. Wilson, however, was a building contractor who understood even less of the shipping business than Mr. Garvey. For reasons understood only to himself, he drew up a contract for $12,000, barely enough to cover our expenses to the banks and back again. On the strength of this contract, we sailed for the Sarana Banks with an empty hold and 32 passengers. We got alongside the Kiyomiru with little trouble, and with the assistance of the Japanese crew, loaded 2,000 tons of her cargo in 2 days. She was pulled off the rocks without incident, and we sailed to New York, but with one stop, in Charleston, South Carolina, to refuel and repair the ever-defective boilers. After 2 such profitless trips, I found myself losing confidence in Mr. Garvey and his business acumen. I decided to make a firm effort to put the line's operations, at least on a sound commercial basis, and drew up a cargo plan containing detailed proposals for accepting and handling freight by weight and cubic measure, and many other provisions which would assure profitable cargo handling operations. I submitted this plan to Mr. O. M. Thompson, general manager of the company. He could not have been less interested. With UNIA membership booming, he could not be bothered with such irksome details. As it turns out, I was too late anyway. The Yarmouth had made her last voyage. Her boilers were beyond repair, and in most other respects, she was no longer a seaworthy vessel. For a number of years, she was laid up in Staten Island, and the transaction which separated her from the Black Star ownership was was of a piece with all the other dealings which marked her brief career under Garvey's auspices. She was finally sold for scrap for $6,000 to cover her wharfage fees. The Black Star Line operated two other ships, the Kanawha and the Shadyside, an excursion boat, and their careers as harbingers of the colored people's commercial resurgence were equally short. Although Garvey boasted that all three vessels were placed under American registry and rechristened the Booker T. Washington, the Frederick Douglass, and the Phyllis Wheatley after colored American heroes, and these names were widely used in UNIA publicity, this was never done. In April of 1922, the Black Star Line collapsed, and with it, many of Garvey's other far flung commercial enterprises. In the court proceedings which followed, it turned out that the line had lost nearly $700,000 in the brief years of its existence, nearly half of it on the Yarmouth. It was also revealed that Garvey had kept no books, issued no financial reports. He was found guilty and sentenced to serve a 5-year term in Atlanta in 1925. He was pardoned in 1927, deported to Jamaica, and died in England in 1940, a broken and embittered man. Throughout the United States, and indeed the world, the impact and failure of the UNIA and the Black Star Line was tremendous. Everyone wanted to know why, and in a series of articles published in the Cleveland Public Journal and Gazette in October of 1923, I tried to give the answers. First, I wrote the management was incompetent. None of the company's officers had the most rudimentary understanding of the shipping business. Mr. Garvey was a great organizer, but a poor businessman. Mr. Jeremiah Certain, the second vice president, was a cigar maker. The executive positions of the company were staffed by opportunists and relatives from all walks of life except the shipping industry. Ocean commerce, especially in the 20s, was one of the most highly rationalized industries in the world. Not only was there a surplus of war-built vessels and many large and efficiently run companies engaged in cargo trade, but then, as now, there was a vast fleet of highly competitive tramp steamers sailing under British, Greek, and other registries fighting for the diminishing cargoes of the post-war world. To compete with such companies effectively meant having good ships, sound capital blocking, and an extensive network of good agents, and above all, efficient management. More important, however, the use to which the worthless Black Star ships were put represented the triumph of propaganda over business. The Yarmouth lost hundreds of thousands of dollars putting into ports where no cargo awaited and being chartered below her worth. Thus, the great and bold dream of colored resurgence ended in catastrophe. For their hard won dollars, scores of thousands of humble Black men and women received in dividends only a transitory inflation of their racial pride. Nor was there anything wrong in that. In fact, it was to be encouraged among a folk so long depreciated. But when the bubble burst, it had to be, as it had to, upon jagged rocks of incompetence and venality, the people were left with their dreams of a bright future blighted. They had no steamship line, no newspaper, no successful challenge to white domination, but instead only monetary loss and, more serious, a deep loss of faith in their own capacities. What had begun as a great adventure for me with hundreds of thousands of others ended in tragedy and disillusionment. It was difficult to compute the suffering that resulted from this idealism. Thousands had mortgaged their homes to buy Black Star stock. Others had sold their furniture and possessions to buy passage to Africa on ships that would never leave port. One man in Cuba sold his profitable lumber business and came to New York to book passage. Dollars evaporated with the dreams, personal ambitions, with the hopes and aspirations of a whole people. For a few brief years, Marcus Garvey fired the torch that lighted the Negro night, bringing dreams of glory and equality. Just as quickly as the torch flickered and was out, leaving us in darkness as before, poor, sadder, and perhaps wiser, but who knows? And we're going to end it right there for tonight. I appreciate each and every one of you. Did anyone want to say anything about Garvey being more interested in building memberships for the UNIA versus the actual seaworthiness of the vessels or the business that he was actually supposed to be undergoing? Because I find it interesting that this sea captain says that Marcus Garvey didn't hire good business people. He hired yes men. He hired people that he knew. And these people had interests in their own aggrandizement more so than they did in the actual running of the business. As he said, they told the man, "You will not get in trouble, Forecast." Forecast says, "I can't say anything or I get in trouble." You will not get in trouble. um, the man said that he told them to charter the ship for $45,000, and for reasons unknown, they decided to charter their ship for a mere $12,000, which wasn't enough money for them to even complete the voyage, really, but they did the task because orders were orders. The pro-Black perspective says it's a tough balance. You need loyal business people. I agree, you do need loyal business people, but you need business people. You need them to know what they're doing. We can't all be hype men. We can't all just hype each other up. I think that he needed more, the people that were the intellectuals that were around him. He needed to tap into their knowledge base so that he could best utilize them for the furthering and upbuilding of the movement. You know, W.B. Du Bois talks about the fact that Garvey's movement was a movement of the people and not a movement of the intellectuals. But Garvey was able to garner a lot of support from the intellectual class. He was able to garner support from the intellectual class, and he was able to pull them into his movement. He was able to galvanized all types of Black people from all different walks of life. He had nurses and doctors. He had intellectuals and elites. He had trash men and taxi cab drivers. He had everybody. He just didn't use them to the best of his ability. Oni says, yeah, that's the issue we have. We don't have many intellectuals, really. Some reason we need foreigners, same reason we need foreigners for nuclear technology. I agree. We do need, we do. And we don't, we don't bring back greetings forecast. How are you tonight?
Hey, what's going on, Mason? How you doing?
I'm doing good. Thanks for coming up.
Yeah, yeah. I just came up. I ain't gonna be long. I just found it interesting because one thing that I did always wonder, I just never said anything, is about Marcus Garvey with the boats, because you hear a lot of people in his time um have some concerns with that. You know what I'm saying? So I never thought that he was like scamming or nothing like that. I don't think that he was like scamming or nothing like that. Um, but also like I think you mentioned it on another one about like shipbuildings, and they don't have the same kind of criteria as they do today. But I just like, even when people like, I never even mentioned it, like in Ida B. Wells in her book, when she talked about Marcus Garvey and how she worked with, she was like, yeah, he's like a real one and all of that. But she would also throw in there like, yo, I hope he's not like doing anything funny with those boats and stuff like that. So I don't know if it's the membership, or like I said, I don't think he was scamming or nothing. It's just interesting to hear kind of what happened, because I didn't know. I just hear the critiques from him.
Right. I hear the critiques as well. I don't think that he was scamming, but I think that he really knew how to raise capital. He was an excellent propagandist, and he needed someone to balance that with the business side of it. He needed to be allowed to do what he does well, while a bean counter was there saying, okay, but first we need to have this first one in New York so that we can get this cargo off this ship unloaded so that we're making money on both ends, or someone that understood the shipping business, that knew the fair market value of what they were actually hauling back and forth up and down those seas. Because a businessman, he had all these offers. Earlier in the text, the author talks about how he had all these offers from all these Cuban businessmen because they were so impressed with the Black Star Line and with the work of it being an all Black operation and enterprise, that they had all of these different offers. And did they get all of those offers because they were undercutting themselves, or did they get all those offers because there was genuine interest there? He needed to balance that. I don't think he was scamming. I just think he was good at what he was good at, and he didn't want to listen. He had to have that type of mindset, because not listening to other if he had listened to others, he would have been one of the Black whites to live a comfortable life, and he would have followed the mold. So he was breaking out of the mold, but he needed someone there that he could trust, and he didn't have anyone there that he could trust that knew enough about these other business ventures to help guide him.
Yeah, yeah, I see that. That definitely makes a lot more sense, because like, yeah, just from what you hear, like the boats always were like, like not up to par, was like not going anywhere. And so yeah, I mean, I'm just interested. It was just interesting to hear that part. And I kind of missed a little bit because I was coming in the house. Like, what do you mean when you were saying he was more interested in gaining members than like whatever.
Well, there were a couple of different times where ships were redirected to ports where there was no cargo, and they had a cargo that they needed to offload. And it was just for propaganda purposes that they had the ships show up, and they had people sign up to be UNIA members in Kingston, Jamaica, and all up and down the coast, and then um and excuse me, all up and down the eastern coast, before they got had offloaded these coconuts that they needed to offload. So they were interested in gaining members and selling the dream and the idea of Black nationalism. And that's beautiful, but you also have to have that business sense about it, where you are actually doing what you say you're going to do. You're actually delivering on what you're delivering on, instead of just showing off people, yeah, we got a boat, it's this boat, you know. I wonder, did he change the names on the boats? Because, boats are also labeled. And the captain here says that it was never officially registered as the Yarmouth, as the Frederick Douglass or the Booker T. Washington, nor the Phyllis Wheatley. Although in UNIA propaganda papers and in pamphlets, they listed it that way. But this captain says that he never changed the names of the boats officially. And so I wonder, did he paint that on there? Did he
Yeah,
paint that on there?
yeah, I would think so. You probably have to pay money to get it like legally changed. So he just like, nah, we changing the name, and he just just did it off the like this is just what it is kind of thing. Like I think, and I think it makes sense. Like there is a I think that is a good idea for to like use it for propaganda, but also I think you should like if you're going to be talking about going like, because one thing about it is like all the people who like sold all of their stuff and really thought that they was going back. Now I probably think that he was like, oh yeah, we're getting these ships, like even if we say we got to fix them up or whatever, I think that all of his intentions was for that. But yeah, I think he just pretty much strong armed it. But I don't know. I like yeah, like I said, like that was just the one thing that everybody always bring up about Marcus Garvey. So like yeah, I mean, but yeah, I don't know. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know either. I don't know either, but they do bring up, the ships, and they wonder about the ships. And I think that he had good intentions. A business plan, an actual business plan, is the most powerful tool that you can ever have, because a business plan forces you to say, I understand these things about my business. I understand that these are the challenges of my business. This is how I plan to overcome these challenges. And, with the boats and the ships, it's safe to say that no, the standards then were not what the standards are now, but that was a lot of money. And he was paying a hell of a black tax when it came to purchasing and acquiring these ships in the first place. Kind of sort of like, when you buy your first car and you're young and you go out there by yourself and you don't know anything, and they pull one over on you and they sell you a lemon. I think Garvey got sold 3 lemons.
Yeah, I think so. And then on top of that, right, is hell, we don't barely have financial literacy now, and not to say it wasn't successful black business people, but on the whole, like literacy rate was like really low at the time. And so, like, yeah, I mean, it'd be easy. It'd be really easy for him to like get got. But yeah, I do think he had good intentions behind it. I don't know, like, yeah, you still. I mean, I guess you should be able to know that your boat is not going to sink or something like that. But that's a part of having somebody who knows something about something around you. And then out of the millions of followers, I'm sure it was like some sailor or somebody who knows something about boats. You know what I'm saying? Like, but that's just a lesson we can learn for the next time. Like, you know, having the right people in it, even if you have followers, I'm pretty sure you have one specific person who's good at boats and evaluating and know the cost and all of that. So I don't know. But financial literacy wasn't. We don't even have it now. So I can only imagine back then.
Absolutely. I think that because Garvey was able to get an education, he understood how some things work, because It was not, if you were able to access education at that time, I think you got more than what you get now. You know, I think you got more information. So that's why he was able to amass so much money and do things and move with that money in different ways. I think that we lack basic education now. And I think that we lack the financial literacy that we need to really be successful. Like, we don't even tell our children, and our elders don't invest in life insurance policies very often anymore unless it's through a job. But there used to be independent policy men that would um come and that would uh would sell you policies at your house. And we don't even do that anymore. So a lot has changed, a lot has stayed the same, but nevertheless, we persevere.
Yeah, facts, facts. And yeah, I remember it was a couple in North Carolina or something like that that had like one of the first after, you know, the Civil War. And then I see it was like, yo, the African Insurance Company, they started in Philly in 1810. So like, you know, black people been doing that insurance thing. But yeah, but yeah, I'm not gonna take up too much of your time, and I ain't gonna say I ain't gonna be say before Bukari and Oni and all y'all get mad at me. So, well, I'm just joking, but thank you for letting me come on though, Matron.
Well, thank you for coming up. I'm getting ready to close out. I want to thank everyone that showed up today. That includes Anthony McPhail, KW Don 7, the Pro Black Perspective, and Brother Bakari, as well as the forecast. I know Sister Raw is listening. I know Dorico Cooper is listening. I know Koku is listening. And all of you, yes, even you, listening to me now. If I did not say your name, charge it to my head and not my heart, because you know you are my people. I thank you for the support that you give to this work. This particular work has been sponsored by Afro Native, The Forecast, and Sister Raw, as well as Bawana Haguziki. I thank each and every one of you for listening today, and I will see you Monday at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, where we will begin reading Marcus Garvey in his own words, and he starts with Why the Black Star Line Failed. All right, guys, thanks for tuning in. Peace.